The race to be Nevada's next governor is on, and Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo thinks he has what it takes. Welcome in. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking with Sheriff Lombardo for about the next hour. I'm joined by my colleagues today, Riley Snyder and Tabitha Mueller, both stellar reporters here at the Indy. This will be a wide-ranging interview. Our goal here is to help voters get to know Sheriff Lombardo better as he makes his bid to become our next governor. Sheriff, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time this morning. We know you're a busy man these days.
Yeah, I was a little taken back when you said, I think I have what it takes.
Well, you can explain to us.
I know I have what it takes. There you go.
Great. So my question then, and give you a chance to explain why you think that. There was a time not too long ago when you had to work pretty closely with our current governor when he was the chair of the Clark County Commission. Right. And I believe you supported his candidacy for governor at that time. What I'd like to know is, when did you stop supporting him? When did your opinion of his job as governor change specifically, and what would you have done differently at that time?
Well, let's back up to the original comment, or I guess there was a question in there about me making a donation to the governor. So Nevada's a small state, and you know the politics is small, and people tend to know everybody across the spectrum. And I did make a donation to Governor Sisolak, but I also made a donation to Adam Laxalt, all in the same week. So it's not unique in that space, because it was up in the air who was going to be the next governor, and quite frankly, you know, Steve Sisolak was the chair of the county commission, as you alluded to, and in control of my budget. So since then, I've changed my mind. You know, you alluded to that, and I just don't agree with the direction he's taken the state. And you know, it started in close proximity to the decisions based on COVID. There was a essential and non-essential, and the governor called upon local law enforcement to enact the enforcement of violations of the COVID restrictions, and you know, the declaration of his power associated with it was unlimited. There was no termination associated with it. Who was essential, who's not essential, let's move the goalposts. And the reasoning behind that, and then forcing law enforcement to go out and do enforcement on that, and trying to explain to somebody that you're not essential in this paradigm, and I know this is what you rely on in your livelihood, but we're going to shut you down. Fortunately, we didn't have to get to that point on the majority of the occasions. I believe only one business was shut down on the heels of the police department. The rest was done by city and county licensing and citations and court appearances that affect their licenses in that space. So that made my decision. So
in your view, and I don't think any of us here probably remember every single type of business that was on the essential or the non-essential list, and I don't expect you to remember, but can you give a couple examples of the types of businesses that in your mind were essential and probably should have been kept open, as opposed to the more of a blanket approach?
You know, we didn't know what we didn't know in the early throes of the COVID, and you know, is it questionable for him shutting down the casinos and the entirety of the economy, you know, outside of your staples like your groceries or your needed necessities or your health care to go on with your life and survive in society. But soon after, we knew there was a flaw in that decision. So I don't blame him. I don't think it was a bad decision to shut down the casinos. Those are people coming into the state. All right, we don't know where they're coming from. We don't know what situation they put themselves in on a daily basis, and we don't know what the infection rate was going to occur. So the science was a little vague in that aspect. So I don't blame that. But soon we knew. You know, there was a decision point associated with the COVID response on overwhelming of the medical services, and whether we could accommodate illness associated with the COVID. And we soon knew, based on science and data, that was not the case. And I had intimate knowledge of that, because day one, the police department was at work. We were considered essential. We had to go out and respond to this calls for service as a matter of public safety. And my employees were affected by the COVID. You know, in the maximum point of that infection rate was, I would have 400 plus people off of work at one time. It's very hard to run a business with that kind of number, right? And the unknowns associated and the quarantine associated with it and everything else that goes along with it. But we knew sooner than later. My opinion, he took way too long to make the decision to lighten up on the economy, open up the economy, the slow death associated with shutting down the economy. And it's going to take years. It's not like turning on and off the light. You know, okay, we're open, the economy's recovering, people's anxiety is going to disappear, and you're going to recover via your revenue streams to be successful into the future. We know that's not the case.
Yeah. So you would have opened up Nevada for business sooner. And what about the mask mandate? Was it, as far as the timing goes of when the mandate went into effect and when it was limited, anything you would have done differently there?
Absolutely. And I'm on the record publicly talking about the mask mandates. I didn't understand the medical science behind the mask mandates. And I just base it on practical reasons in my own evaluation of it. The infection wasn't being affected by the mask mandates. I had the incubator. I had the beta tester in my police department. I had 6,000 employees at my disposal that I could do measurements associated with that, being in the public space on a daily basis. And the mask mandates come into play. Did our infection rate fluctuate as a result of that? No. We continue to have a similar situated infection rate with that.
All the way
and then you look at, the material mandate, which was none associated with the mask. We know as we talk to the scientists or we listen to the periodicals or do our own education, the material did make a difference, but there was no mandate on the material.
You mean what the masks are made out of?
Right? Interesting enough, I was just on an airline and you could see through the stewardess's mask. And so that was a frustration piece for them. They're mandated to keep it on, but then you can see through it. So you know it's not doing anything, right? And then you do it in practical measures. And I always compare it to like a surgeon. So a surgeon goes into a surgery room, puts on a mask, does not touch their mask, hopefully, right? And then immediately upon completion of the surgery, discards the mask. I carried my mask in my pocket for a month or two, right? And so if there was COVID associated with that mask, it would be on the front-facing piece of that material, which would cause an infection to occur. I never got the COVID. And so in my personal opinion, the mask didn't work. It was political theater to me.
So you would have lifted the mask mandate pretty quickly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, let's pivot to another topic.
Yeah, I want to ask about elections, and I think you've gotten this question probably in every interview since you've announced your run for governor, but I think it's fair to say that you have repeatedly said you didn't see any fraud that would change your opinion of Nevada's results in the 2020 election.
Right.
I wanted to ask, do you see or have any reason to believe that Joe Biden is not the duly elected president of the United States?
No, I didn't vote for him, but I don't see any reason to say that he's not the duly elected president of the United States. Now, with that being said, Riley, it's important for people to understand my position on this. I think the election system has the ability to have fraud associated with it. The evidence was not brought forward that we could prosecute on it, and 34 years in law enforcement, that's what I base a lot of my decision on, is actual evidence and not anecdotal information that is not to be proven. So in Georgia, they did identify some fraud. I believe it might have been Mississippi, I can't remember, they identified some fraud. But why wouldn't the fraud be committed on both sides of the aisle if it was going to be committed? And that's my opinion. What I would do and what I'm concerned with is the sanctity of the system and the ability for people to feel confident that their vote matters and there's not going to be a fraud associated with it, and it's firm and fair and complete in an election process. So and my platform includes the implementation of voter ID, the repeal of the universal mail, and the ballot harvesting associated with it. I feel those particular items would bring the sanctity to the voting system, the election system, and have people feel confident in the system.
Yeah. How do you feel about other candidates for governor or even candidates for Secretary of State, the next person to run our voting system, kind of repeat these unfounded theories that there was massive fraud in Nevada in the nation's 2020 election? I mean, there's a pretty good chance that you might end up serving next to a Jim Marchand or someone else who said they want to decertify.
You know what I've learned in life is I bitch up, not down. I'm not going to make comments reference people down the ticket. I'm running for the position of governor. And I'll speak similar to they did at Keystone, the 11th Amendment of Ronald Reagan. I'm not going to speak ill of my fellow Republicans.
In general, though, without naming names, just looking at the broad swath of mostly Republicans who keep insisting that there was widespread fraud in Nevada, do you think that does damage to the civic fabric? Is in your mind, does that undermine trust in elections to a point that is problematic, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I think I alluded to that in my previous answer. It does. I mean, people are in fear that their vote doesn't matter, and that's the most important piece associated with our election, the sanctity of our republic and what we were built on associated with elections and your ability to vote and how important that is. But it's frustrating when we have mechanisms in there to create an environment for fraud or to ease the fraud environment. And what I mean by that is universal mail. You know, we can't. We're not tracking that ballot all the way to fruition, and there's no reason to do that if people do not request it. Yeah, I support mail-in ballots on people that request it.
So would you look to repeal then the law
Yes.
that put universal mail-in
Yes.
ballots in place?
Yes, I would.
And what do you mean specifically? When you say they're not tracked all the way through? Where's the breakdown? in
There's
your
no voter ID associated with it. We know there was ballots sent out to locations that were no longer viable locations. In other words, people didn't live there, or they may have passed away, or they moved. A plethora of reasons. I've gone by different apartment complexes as a matter of me doing businesses and seeing those U.S. mail buckets with ballots stacked in them, you know, and it just creates an environment for people to breach those envelopes and do what they do to cause harm.
So ultimately, doesn't that boil down to our signature verification process? I mean, that's the real bottom line here, isn't it?
Well, let me give you an example of that. Yes, it does. Signature verification process. Do you feel confident in that process? I could give you an example. My last 6 elections, I personally adulterated my signature, and I was not questioned about it once.
You purposely adjusted your signature
Yes,
so that it
see,
wouldn't
to
exactly
verify
match?
whether the process worked or not.
And in all cases,
Was not confronted a single time.
That's interesting. I'm curious. In what way did you change it?
Well, it still says Joe Lombardo when I sign it. It wasn't a fictitious name, but it's just the way I presented it compared to what my driver's license signature says.
Interesting. While we're on the topic of elections, this is sort of loosely related. I found it interesting. I've heard you've said a couple of times that you think single party rule is a bad idea. And for those watching, I'll explain what that means. That the same party shouldn't control the governor's mansion in both houses of the legislature. That's what you meant by that, right?
Correct.
So I guess what I want to ask you is, in an election year where all the pundits and election watchers are talking about a possible red wave, where potentially Republicans could win up and down the ticket, if you become governor and the Republicans were to win both houses of the legislature, do you still see that as not good for the state?
Not necessarily. The reason why I say that is because I believe the current governor is non-communicative. He's not open to both sides of the aisle and opinions from both sides of the aisle, where in fact I am.
Okay, so in your mind, you're the factor that would make the difference there.
Absolutely.
I want to ask one more question about elections. We've seen efforts in several rural counties, I think most recently Nye County, to try to move towards hand counting of ballots, move away from any use of electronic counting machines. Are you supportive of those efforts? Is that a direction you'd like to see Nevada's voting system move towards?
No, I think we should have a similar situated voting system throughout the state, but we need to have confidence in the system.
So I wanted to turn to a slightly different topic, and that's housing. We've seen rent prices increasing across the country and here in Nevada. One question I had is, if the legislature sends you a bill authorizing local governments to enact rent control policies, would you sign that and support it?
No, I'm saying no now because I'm not well informed enough on that. I think we need to bring some industry experts associated with that and look at different states that have it. Example being New York or California in that space. Has there been a benefit associated with rent control? And just in the short time that's been brought up, and people are talking about it as a possible solution for affordable housing, I've heard both sides of of the equation on that. You know, some people support it, some don't, and here's the detriment associated with that type of process or thinking versus the other side, the benefit. And I don't know enough about it to say that if a bill hits my desk, I'm going to sign it.
But you wouldn't be opposed to signing it?
No, I wouldn't be opposed to anything as long as it's based on sound fundamental processes and for the benefit of the state and the people in the state of Nevada.
And then one other kind of follow-up question is, in your view, kind of what is within the scope of the government's authority in the governor's office to address this housing crisis, right? What could the governor do in your mind?
Well, you know, I was asked that, and one of the questions is, what's the governor's ability or authority, or I guess the ability is the word, under the inflation issue, right? So you can fix that via wages. You know, when we talk about minimum wages and ability to pay for goods and services, which is directly related to inflation, and the ability to have good jobs associated with wages. So it's important, and the key component on that, Tabitha, you hit on it, is affordable housing. The governor has a direct influence, a huge influence on how we approach affordable housing. So recently on the ARP funds that the governor talked about in the State of the State, to me, that's a spray and pray philosophy he utilized. We have $500 million allocated to affordable housing, but associated with that was a mandate of PLAs, project labor agreements. And so that in turn in itself raises the costs associated with construction. And so if your idea or your vision was 5,000 homes to provide to the general public in a affordable housing space subsidized by the government, that's 2,500 homes now. So the governor has a huge influence in that space. And you know, when you talk about land and the ability to have affordable land for developers to have affordable housing, negotiations could be conducted with BLM. You know, maybe we can defer the cost of the original cost of the BLM in the out years after the development is done, and then generate the revenue or the costs or the payment associated with that land in the out years, so we're not incurring all the costs on the front end. You got to have different examples of that and different ideas associated with that versus just, hey, we have this amount of money, we're going to throw it to the will of the people, and hopefully we get some answers out of it. And in my personal opinion, those answers are flawed in his design of that money.
Is there anything you would have, I know he asked you this at your filing announcement, you didn't want to get too into the details on what you would have done differently, but just on that specific piece of what Governor Sisolak proposed for affordable housing, you mentioned the $500 million. Do you think that was enough? Obviously, it sounds like you're opposed to the...
No, a dollar's better than nothing, right? Right, but you know, and if you have empty land, you're not receiving property tax associated with it. You know, vacant land. So, would I have done something different? Yeah, I would have spread the wealth a little bit more versus limiting it to project labor agreements. And you know what? And I know you're probably going to segue into this, so I'll head it head on. Is I support collective bargaining, I support unionization, but the playing field has to be level. Everybody has to have equal opportunity to enter into the commerce section of the economy equally, no matter if they're union or not.
So your concern then was that it was specifically targeted at unions and not open to, say, other developers?
Exactly.
I can ask about collective bargaining. So as governor, you'd have the right to obviously forego any negotiated salary increase with state employees who have collectively bargained. So I guess, first off...
That's an interesting piece, right? Yeah. I mean, no other collective bargaining process includes the governor or the head of the agency having the last right of refusal, right? We're all bound by arbitration. I cut you off, so what's the question?
The question is, would you use that power if you were governor?
Well, that's the way it's written, right? That's the way the process is written and the law has been written associated with that. Unfortunately, you know, if you look at the law enforcement space, I think he's been very non-proactive in that, in our ability to have a safe community in the state of Nevada associated with the state police.
Would you seek any cost of living increase or raises for state employees at this time, whether it's wholesale or just specifically for highway patrol?
You
or
know,
other
you got to look, the first and foremost question in any collective bargaining environment is the ability to pay. And does the state have the ability to pay? And that's the first question that has to be answered. And if they do, yes, the employee they deserve a good form of living and good wages. We talked about that in an inflation process. You got to have good wages in order to be successful in life. And if you're not keeping up with inflation or the cost of living or interest rates, you have to use that paradigm and figure it out.
If Republicans do take control of the legislature next session and they do pass a bill repealing state worker collective bargaining, which has only been in place for about 4 years now.
I'll evaluate it at the time.
Okay, I want to segue again to criminal justice reform, which I'm sure you expected to come up. So just I think first off I wanted to ask, what's your position on the death penalty?
I support the death penalty. As long as there's due process.
Yeah. I wanted to, because this has come up on the Republican primary trail, are some comments you made in June 2020. I think it was to Channel 8. You were asked a question about defunding the police, and you mentioned you'd be supportive of defunding the police if that meant supporting social workers, that type of profession. Now that we're here and we're in the campaign season, I wanted to give you a chance to kind of expand on that. Is that still your position? Or
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's interesting. You make a statement and how it gets construed because you don't have all the narrative associated within the byline changes or gives you a certain influence on people's ideas. Yes, the answer to that question, I don't support defunding the police when we're talking about putting cops on the street. Do not support it. Cops make a difference. They're influential in everything associated with the economy and the quality of life in any society. What I was referring to, and I thought I explained myself well in this space, but obviously I didn't. I'm glad you brought up the question so we can talk about it a little bit more. A significant amount of our work in law enforcement is dedicated to people that are in distress. Homelessness, social issue, hunger, mental health, drug abuse, and those are volatile populations. And over the years, cops have asked to expand their resumes to deal with everything under the sun. And quite often, the answer to every social ill is dial 911, right? So if you don't have an answer, dial 911, have the cops show up and expect them to solve the problem. We are duly bound not to walk away. Okay, so it's important for people to realize that. But we are putting the cops, my cops, the state's cops, in position of liability and unsuccess. They're met with not success because of lack of resources. It'd be very simple to encounter a person in distress. You have a limited amount of training to negotiate with that individual, and then hopefully you could provide them some service on the back end to solve the problem. That is not the case. And we are not the experts of all things. And unfortunately, or fortunately, there are people out there that are better situated in negotiating with individuals in distress and identifying resources on the back end for them to get solutions to the problem. That's what I was talking about. If I can allocate some budgetary money within my existing budget that would help my cops respond to calls for service and be met with success versus failure, I would support that. But unfortunately, there hasn't been a program brought forward. So you hear anecdotal programs across the United States with cops, departments, and local governments trying to achieve some of those programs, but the proof is not in the pudding yet. The success rate is very poor. And what quite often happens in those situations is that's a very volatile demographic. Those individuals may cause harm in situations, and those people aren't able to protect themselves. So what ends up happening? We have police officers escorting them in that space. So that's what I was talking about.
When you said those comments, we were in a very different time than we are now, and you're in a different position now, right, as a candidate for political office, not as sheriff. I guess, do you wish, or do you have any regret over using the term like defund the police in that context?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it at face value without any back end support on it, yeah, it does not sound right? And unfortunately, people looked at it that way. And I'm here to tell you right up front, I do not support defunding the police. Okay, I support evaluating existing programs.
Sheriff, let me ask you this, since we're here. So the onus for defunding the police by those who are continuing to call for it are issues with what we call use of force. I think it all centers there, right? Problems with use of force. Tell us a little bit, just 1 minute, on how much training do your officers get on that fall under the umbrella of use of force. In other words, how to subdue, let's say, a violent individual who maybe is, in the middle of a drug OD situation. Cops have been called. You're on the scene. You're trying to deal with it. Tamp down the situation. Just tell us real quickly, how much training is there, and do you think it's enough training?
So it's hard to quantify a number on how much training. I think the percentage would probably be more conducive to that question, and the majority of the training that police officers receive is in the use of force space, predominantly in the academy space. When they're first hired as police officer, use of force is probably the predominant training regimens that they go through. And then you have your post-required training, police officer standards training, that is done on an annual basis. That is, they have to participate in, and that's the tune of 12 hours a year. That's the minimum, okay? Just with the restrictions at LVMPD, I can't speak for the rest of the state. That's the minimum for the rest of the state, but LVMPD, it's twofold. It's twice as much training associated with use of force. And we have a critical task test that encompasses use of force training that must be completed on an annual basis by the police officers. So your question was, is it enough? That's a very difficult question to answer, and here's why. We alluded to it in Riley's question. We're asked to do a lot as police officers and law enforcement, so we have to have training associated with everything we do. So it will never be enough, but we don't have the ability for it to be enough with all the other things that we have to do in the law enforcement space. But I'm here to tell you that LVMPD and the rest of the state of Nevada, because we participate in the post process as a matter of requirements across the state. The state of Nevada is a very well-trained law enforcement force in the use of force space.
In a similar vein, you've said in the past that you believe sentencing reform is necessary, but you've not clarified what that reform should be. What reform would you like to see in terms of sentencing?
Tabitha, I don't know when the last comprehensive evaluation of sentencing has been done in our society. And even when it's completed, it can still be construed, or people have a different point of context or a different opinion on the results of those studies. All I do know is since sentencing has been reformed, lessening of sentences associated with particular crimes and particular crimes of violence, the crime rate has increased. Is that directly related? Yeah, in my opinion, it is. But what is the answer to whatever particular crime it may be? So say it's murder or homicide, or if it's a robbery, is 20 years the appropriate amount of time to change somebody's behavior? And that's what has to be done by the people that are smarter than me, the experts in the field, to determine whether that is the right direction to go or the right answer. Now, when we go back to the legislature, there was a very comprehensive package brought forward by Assemblyman Yeager, and to me, it was too cumbersome. It was laborious. There wasn't enough time spent directly related to that sentencing reform within the package, amongst a bunch of other things, right. And it was too fast and too soon.
So would you?
There's a lot of unintended consequences on people when you talk about something this important to make decisions in a vacuum.
So 2 questions. Would you look to repeal that, then, the bill that you're talking about?
No, not at this point, but I think it maintains continual evaluation. I would not accept any lessening of that legislation. I don't agree with some of the legislation that was brought forward, but that would be something for the legislature to discuss and for me to evaluate when it hits the desk.
And then that second part is, do you deserve any blame for the rising crime rates that are happening in Las Vegas? What would you say to people that
No,
click on
absolutely not. So let me put that in context, and I don't want anybody to conceive that as arrogance. It's based in reality. So the last 7 years as the sheriff in Clark County, we had a 35% decrease in crime across the board. In the last year, we had a 5% increase in crime. Why is that? Washoe County had a 28% increase in crime. Why is that? It isn't because I'm out campaigning, as people allude to, or I'm not paying attention because I'm running for governor versus thing. It's because the system changed, and I alluded to this. The single party rule, flawed decision, no discussion across the board. Let's push these flawed ideas of reference laws across the table. And then the governor accepted it without any pushback, without any veto associated with the process. And that's what changed. And you can't use Nevada as an insular test. It's occurring across the United States. That whole attitude has changed across the United States. And we have to pull back from that. And it's very important for people to understand the law and order piece of society is probably one of the most important pieces for the success of society. The economy, the education, and everybody's quality of life into the future is on the backbone of law and order.
And then, we've seen candidates on the Republican side running on this rising crime rate. What would you say to that, kind of pointing to law and order, like the need for law and order?
Yeah, I thought I answered that question just now, but I would, yeah, I mean, I understand why they're doing it because it's a reality, right? It's a reality. We have businesses shutting down across the United States. We have businesses shutting down in Vegas as a result of crime. People don't feel comfortable. The most important thing in anybody's life is feeling safe. And that's what my platform and that's what my campaign is based on. The majority of it is based on that. And me being a subject matter expert in that space, I feel I have the leadership and experience that people in Nevada can trust in there. And that's my intent to move us forward.
I've got a tough question for you, I think.
I'm not afraid of you.
Good. So you're supporting Kevin McMahon in his bid for sheriff.
This is not going to be a tough question.
Oh, great. So I don't know how much the viewers are aware of it, but I know that you must be aware of it. So recently it came to light, there were allegations about 3 decades ago of misconduct by McMahon and another officer, and a recommendation at that time by a superior officer that they both be removed from the force, but only one of them left and McMahon remained. What do you remember about what happened with all that back then? And then explain why you're supporting him, why you think he's the best man to fill your shoes.
So let me start it with this way. One is I'm fully endorsing Kevin McMahon, and I haven't swayed from that, and I will continue to endorse him. 2 is I don't remember anything, okay? And I don't mean to be in the context of what Starbucks Anthony answered. I don't remember anything because I wasn't associated with that 25 years ago. I worked in a complete different part of the department.
What were you doing back then? Do you mind just saying?
I don't know. I was probably an undercover narcotics detective.
Okay.
If it was 25 years ago. Yeah, that's probably about right.
Okay.
And so I've learned about this, the majority of it here recently, being schooled and educated on it now. But, you hear rumors in the police department or any organization for your entire career. So maybe some ancillary information associated with that reached me at some point, and maybe there were some ancillary discussions about it. But he was not in my chain of command. I was not his supervisor. He's been through, I'm the 3rd sheriff. He's been through since then. So I'm not intimate in the knowledge associated with that. So I know I was going to be asked about this, and so I've educated myself. And one thing I pride myself at LVNPD and in law enforcement in general is we are very responsible in holding our own accountable. We're probably the most proactive in that space out of any industry or any profession in the United States, because people have to have confidence in their police department. They have to have trust in it. Kevin McMahon went through the process. And my understanding is the complainant recanted her story. That's why Kevin McMahon was cleared associated with that. And we move forward 25 more years. The process, he was put through the process, he survived the process, he was determined exonerated as part of that situation, and he has moved on. Discipline is intended to change behavior. He didn't receive discipline, so his behavior was accepted.
So I've got two follow-ups in two different directions. So it has been reported that the officer who complained at the time, I don't know that she fully recanted. I think she told two versions of a story, and it's been characterized as the fact that she recanted. But when all this came to light, did you talk to Kevin McMahon about this? Have you two ever spoken about this matter, let's say just within the last month or so?
Yes.
Okay, and what are you willing to tell us about that conversation?
Well, first and foremost, it was an apology on him that they dragged my name into the whole paradigm.
He apologized to you?
Yes, and that his situation dragged my name into the political process. And I told him, no reason to apologize. You went through the process. I have total confidence in our internal process of evaluating improper actions by any individual employee within the LVMPD. And they determined he was exonerated of that, and he moved forward with his career.
So that's my other question, and it's really just kind of an administrative one, which maybe at the time you probably couldn't answer, but now you probably can. So the one unanswered question in this whole McMahon story that has come up is, how did it come to be that he was recommended for termination by a superior officer? Then the pre-termination hearings occurred. I believe that's the process, where there's a period of hearings and everyone gets to say what they think. Investigation basically is ongoing, and then obviously there's a finding. But because there was a recommendation for termination, I just want to ask you administratively, is there anything fishy about the fact that there was a recommendation of termination and then it just went away? And the Nevada Independent has requested proof, information, documents related to what happened between the recommendation for termination and the decision to not terminate. Can you clarify what was likely the case at that time? In other words, did the supervisor have to pull back his recommendation for termination? Would that have had to have happened, or what's the process?
Well, to that case in particular, I don't know. Actually, I do not know, and I don't want anybody leaving. I don't want me leaving this interview and people saying that's unacceptable, that he doesn't know. You know, that this guy was his undersheriff and he should have known and he should have done his own research associated with that. I don't know. I don't know what the details on that. I haven't done a public records request on that, and I don't believe there's a need for me to do that at this point. Like I said, I have confidence in the process prior to that. But to explain, help you understand the process is, you go through an IAB investigation. IAB does not make recommendation for discipline. They just present the facts to the chain of command.
Tell the people watching what IAB stands for.
Oh, Internal Affairs Bureau. Okay. They do the internal investigation when there's a complaint alleged against a police officer or even a civilian employee, any employee within the LVMPD. They go through the facts, they determine the facts of the situation, they present the case upon completion of the investigation to a supervisor. The supervisor, based on what they read and what they determine as a base of that reading and talking to the individual investigators, make a recommendation on discipline. If it rises to termination, that will go to the sheriff to say yay or nay, for it to go to the preterm board. And the preterm board makes the recommendation if we continue with the recommendation of termination. So in this case, they may have said, no, it doesn't rise to that level, send it back for alternate discipline. And now I know in Kevin McMahon's case, he ended up in court associated with this. So, you know, if you have binding arbitration, you go to an arbitrator in this case, but in a criminal case, which I believe is the allegation based on this, it will go to a regular court system.
Okay, thanks.
That's what I know about it.
I'm curious. So Kevin McMahon isn't with Metro anymore, correct?
Correct.
You're still the head of Metro, right?
Correct.
Are there records that you could look up to like figure out what has happened here?
Yeah, the only problem with it is I don't know if they've been purged. They're more than likely, because it's 25 years old, they've been purged.
Would you be willing to commit to the voters in Nevada that you'll make an effort to at least ask?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's incumbent upon me to do that, to breed confidence in the system.
So let's head right back into K-12 education, a huge part of any governor's tenure and responsibility in that office. And I think first off, I just wanted to ask, a straight up question. Do you think Nevada schools at this moment are underfunded?
I don't know. And I've said it publicly that we need to do a complete audit of the system. Day one, when elected governor, that we go into the system and determine whether the funds are being allocated appropriately and where they need to be allocated. One of the unfortunate pieces, I'll go back up in a minute, on COVID. And we were talking about the response to COVID. And the state is different everywhere you go in the state. It's not all one complete, similar package in the state of Nevada. And I believe where I'm going with this, Riley, is I believe the response to COVID, the answers couldn't be all one answer. Every county is different, every nuance is different, every demographic is different in every county, and I believe the county should have the autonomy to make their decisions on the COVID response and the prophylactics with that. So now we move into education. Every county's different. And we quite often talk about Southern Nevada and the Clark County School District and its voluminous size and its cumbersomeness, and whether it can be managed appropriately with the current organization, the way it's set up. So to answer your question, an audit and an evaluation of the existing system needs to be done, a complete, comprehensive one, prior to making a decision whether it's funded appropriately.
So when you see news stories or reports that Nevada's per pupil spending figures are below the national average or ranked 49th or whatever they are, you're not...
I don't believe that's accurate. So I think the per pupil funding formula is a little bit higher than that. So, but I cut you off. What was the question?
You want to see an audit, you want to see more.
Yeah, I want to see some more complete data, and that's part of my personality too. I'm a little wonky in that space, and I like the math associated and data associated with any situation and evaluation of a situation to make a decision based on knowledge versus conjecture.
So I might run into that same answer here, but do you think Nevada teachers statewide and in Clark County are underpaid?
I have no idea. You know what? Let me back up on that. Have no idea. I'm not sure. I always think teachers are underpaid. Let me couch it that way. But I want to make sure that their pay scale is appropriate for the economy of Nevada. I wish I could pay them a fortune, right? I think they have a very difficult, especially in today's age, a very difficult job, and pay makes a difference in somebody's quality of life and whether they even want to do the profession or not. But we need to base it on the industry standard and what's appropriate and not appropriate.
When Governor Sisolak was running in 2018, one of his campaign promises was a raise for teachers, and I think finally in the 2019 session they were able to work out a 3% raise. Are you promising anything similar, any kind of raise for teachers?
No, I have to, like I said, I have to make sure that we look at the situation they're in currently and whether it's appropriate or not. I don't want to arbitrarily pander. The word I'll use is pander for votes. And in my opinion, when you make bold statements like that without information, that's pandering. And I think it's appropriate for the taxpayers of Nevada and the people of Nevada that I do my due diligence.
Are there any changes to the education funding current system that it's set up, right? We often hear about there's the pie and we're changing the pie slices in different ways based on school district and different sizes, which the legislature started last year. But given your stance on taxes, are there any changes to that funding structure that you would seek?
No, not currently. I think the only issue that I think one of the issues that's we really need to take a deep look at is the infrastructure allocation in Southern Nevada. The quality of life of the teachers in Southern Nevada are unacceptable, and what I mean by that is the per pupil per teacher. The number of pupils per teacher is unacceptable in Southern Nevada.
What do you think it should be on average?
On the average, and don't quote me. Well, you're going to quote me because I'm on videotape, but
Or a range?
well, from the teachers I've talked to and various other subject matter experts, 1 per 20 seems to be manageable. In Southern Nevada, it's much higher than that.
Nevada's current class size reduction program sets similar limits for number of kids in a classroom per teacher. School districts apply for waivers and are granted waivers generally. Is that something you want to
No.
stop seeing?
No, I want to stop seeing, yes. I want to stop seeing because, if you have the ability to make excuses, you're going to make them. And if you put a comprehensive plan together and provide some direction and ensure that the resources are allocated appropriately, you need to get it done. And they identified it as a problem, and if you're making excuses for it or giving them the ability to get out of the obligation, they'll do it. I just know that from working a business, being the CEO of a big company for years, and that's not how you solve problems.
When Nevada lawmakers amended the school funding formula in the last legislative session, what they did was take a bunch of individual fund accounts that went towards various education programs and put it into the big new funding formula. One of those accounts was class size reduction. That was emptied and put into the new funding formula. Do you think there should be separate targeted money?
No, I think it's too cumbersome to manage that way. I agree with the system they came up with in the last legislative session. But this also goes back to questions that we've had previously, like in Keystone about regulations. It's so hard, it's so cumbersome, it takes too long to put the shovel in the ground and get the facility erected, right? And that's due to cumbersome regulations. And I think the sooner that we can get infrastructure into the space of Southern Nevada, the better we'll all be.
I want to toss one in here too, if Riley will allow me. When he was governor, Sandoval championed something that we all called read by 3.
Correct. I mentioned that in my last interview.
And as I'm sure you're aware, the Democrats basically gutted it.
Yes, I am aware.
Came into power, so it was policy in Nevada. We were on our way, and it no longer is. Would you bring back read by
Yes.
3 if it was in your?
Yes. So I went to the state of the school district here recently with the superintendent, and I tell you what, it made my skin crawl to hear that 7 out of 10 third graders do not read at the third grade level, and that's a troublesome. I believe it was 9 out of 10 of 11th graders are not at the math level they need to be at. Very unacceptable. So we have to find solutions, make it a priority, and fix that particular paradigm. So you can't reward mediocrity. And in that situation that you described, you're rewarding mediocrity. Okay, well, they're not there. Let's just keep them going. And we have to have some negative sanctions associated with bad behavior. It's not bad behavior when it comes to the kids, but it's bad behavior as part of policy.
I wanted to ask about staffing shortages. This is a problem we've seen here in Northern Nevada, also in Southern Nevada, in terms of not having enough bus drivers or other school support professionals in the classroom. Is there anything in particular that you think the state should be doing or that you as governor would do?
Yes, occupational licensing. I think the state has done a deplorable job of making it very cumbersome for people to bring their licenses from other jurisdictions into the state and occupy those type of jobs legally and appropriately.
If you decided that in some part of the education budget more money was needed, would you be open to a property tax hike?
No, I wouldn't be open to a property tax hike, but I would be open to a reevaluation on how we conduct property tax. Well, conduct's probably not the right word, but the process. And what I mean on it is point of sale, of resale, an adjustment of the valuation of the property from point of sale versus the point of enactment, on its original built date. And in my opinion, that's not necessarily a new tax. That's a reevaluation of an existing tax.
Is that something you feel you can do as governor, or something that would require constitutional change based on?
It would be legislative.
And I guess on the Independent Commission on School Funding, I think the reason we wanted to ask this was you previously stated you support the new funding formula and how that model divides how the state's support of schools is funded. But this Independent Commission on School Funding also came out and said we need, $2 billion more to meet these targets over the next 10 years. How do you square those two things?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, right? And that's the role of the governor to come up with some plan to answer those questions. And you have to evaluate your existing systems, right? Can we get by with lesser government and reallocate that fund and push them into that funding formula allocation, I guess. You have to look at the existing system, especially with me coming forward with a platform of no new taxes. You have to figure out where it's going to be generated. Is it going to be through the seat tax or the sale tax, just by natural increases, or are we going to have to reallocate with smaller government?
I want to ask one question on the no new taxes pledge, because we often hear that from candidates, right? And there's like kind of a range there.
Well, I think we're hearing about it from my opponent too, right?
In your mind, does no new taxes mean you're going to sign the Americans for Tax Reform tax pledge, not approve any fee increase?
I'm not interested in pledges. I'm not interested in that. And I just think that paints you in a corner that there's no reason to be in that corner.
Yeah. So it's fair to say that you're open to modifying tax rates, like you mentioned.
I said it publicly. I said tax reform, and what I mean by that is, can we do a better way of doing business? No increase in revenue, reallocation.
And just one final topic on K through 12 education that I want to ask about is school choice. You've endorsed it. It comes up at almost every Republican candidate debate.
Right.
Do you believe school choice alone is going to solve
No.
all of our education problems?
No. School choice is a fantastic idea, and I support it, but there's also limited space, right? And not everybody can choose to go to the same school, right? So we have to expand on what resources are available, and that could be done through the voucher systems, the education savings account, and expansion of charter schools, all right, or your opportunity scholarships, expansions of that. You have to have more available options associated with it. School choice on its own is not the answer. It's part of the answer. I believe it's a very necessary answer, but it's not the only answer.
Let's move to immigration just for a second.
You've said that you would have a zero tolerance policy for illegal immigration if you're elected. In the past,
No.
Okay, correct me on that
That's not what
then.
I said. Okay. I said zero policy for people that commit violent crimes. Okay? There's no intent to be proactive in the field per se. I've always supported when bad guys commit crimes upon our society, our communities, that they should be removed. And I will continue to support that.
So just to make sure that I understand that for you, so that was taken out of context then, that zero tolerance policy.
Yes.
So a PAC supporting you is running an ad, references, there's an audio clip where you said that you, in your time as sheriff, deported about 10,000 undocumented immigrants. Is that, do you stand by that figure?
Yes, but there's some clarification. I don't recall, you better situated than me, it said his time as sheriff. No, his time as being responsible for the program. So I was responsible for the 287G program as both the deputy chief and an assistant sheriff, which fell under my supervision and control, to include my time as a sheriff. So that number is not directly limited to as time as the sheriff. It's over a greater time period. And I stand by that number.
And those who were deported, we have you've said that your standard for calling to attention the behavior of an illegal immigrant is violent acts. So is it the case that all 10,000 of those were convicted of or had committed violent crimes?
My tenure as a sheriff, but prior to that, no. I mean, we are we were directed or controlled by the criteria that was presented by ICE at that time and whatever particular president was in place. So that started under secured communities under President Obama, and then it moved into 287G at the tail end of Obama's tenure to include President Trump and President Biden. So in that space, there was not ability or opportunity, that's probably the wrong words. The evaluation of bad guys committing crimes included people with warrants. And they may be warrants associated with misdemeanor crimes that were nonviolent. But that got modified through time, and as my time as the sheriff, violent crime to include DUI and domestic violence.
As governor, would you want to keep the governor's office of New Americans?
Yes, I think it's a productive office because of these particular issues, right? We have to make sure that the state as a whole is speaking with the same voice versus individual jurisdictions.
And do you think Nevada should be welcoming refugees, whether from Afghanistan or Ukraine or wherever else?
Yes, if properly vetted. Me being in law enforcement and prior military, I know that the record keeping and the systems associated with foreign countries is not as robust as the United States, and it's very important that we ensure that bad actors are not landing on our soil and intending to create harm into the future. I don't have a lot of confidence in the current situation of Afghani refugees and the vetting of those individuals, because we've already experienced, even in the state of Nevada, some of those individuals coming into the state and committed crimes. So it's important for the federal government to do their due diligence before it's thrust upon local states.
All right, Sheriff, that'll have to be the last word. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in to watch our interview. Follow us all year long for elections coverage at thenevadaindependent.com, and we'll see you online.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.